Welcome to Real Rover. I'm your roving host, John Craig. Real Rover へようこそ、Craig John でございます。Introducing you to people you would never have heard of if it wasn't for Real Rover. Here we go. Welcome to Real Rover, Michael Smith, and to describe what you do it is actually challenging, but your clinic is called Integrative Health Solutions in Nelson, British Columbia, and I know that you are a qualified doctor of Chinese medicine and that you have other skills as a health detective, as you are called, which I think is a really good name. But that's part of the shaman in your work. That's part of the teacher in your work, because you're also teaching people Taoist practices that are very useful to them. So there's the doctor, and there's the teacher, and there's the shaman, all in there, which is what you would want in an integrative health solution person. So welcome, Michael, to Real Rover, and thank you for your time. I know it's about 8 p.m. in Nelson, BC. It must be dark, is it? It must be dark.
Yeah, it is very dark. Yeah.
If it wasn't dark, I'd be worried.
Yeah, well, it's February, so it's really dark and quiet.
It's really nice. Dark and quiet. Well, here in Japan, suddenly the birds are coming back to life. The nightingale is back. And the cuckoo is, and these birds are coming back, and the spring blossoms are coming out, although it's been a cold winter. So it's very light here, and it's very dark there, which is kind of interesting. Since I was going to put the yin-yang symbol behind me, but I thought this would be less shocking.
Well, we'll play that part.
So, Michael, I know from your blog and from your teaching that you spent some of your formative years in what we call the bush. Can you go into that a bit? How it affected you, what you did?
I would say the biggest effect that had on me, and this might sound cryptic, but I think it fundamentally taught me what attention is for.
Ah.
And I make that statement knowing the difference, having lived in civilization for most of my life. But I guess being one of the few people who've lived without television and radio and hunted and trapped and tracked as a child, and spent a lot of time waiting to, hunt or fish, where you just have to sit and wait and listen. The easiest way to describe it is actually to bring up the Chinese or Taoist concept of feng shui. Because when you actually look at the earliest teachings on feng shui, it was about where you would set up a camp when you were hunting. It wasn't, where put a mirror just in case your door was pointing to the wrong part of the compass, right? And that stuff's important too. But I remember spending a lot of my childhood, walking around with a very large dog, because there was very large animals and I was a kid. So, and there was a couple of times in my life when I was young where I actually had to deal with a very large animal. So, but what I would encourage anyone to imagine is, spending a lot of your childhood walking through the bush, being aware that, you're looking for the sources of life, the trees, the berries, or other things that certain animals live on. And you're aware of the topography, the shape of the land, because that determines where the sun and the shadow is going to be, another way of looking at yin yang. And also just air movement and scent trails, because once you have a three-dimensional moving image of what the feng shui or the wind and the water is doing, you have pretty much an immediate sense of where hunting and trapping and tracking is actually going to work. So I would say that the difference with respect to attention is I grew up with a 360 by 360 degree relationship with pay attention or be food, which I think had a lot to do with my skill set as a martial artist and other things. But I noticed that even now I'm in my 50s, if I don't spend enough time just in nature, I can feel my attention, moving kind of like the periscope of a submarine, where it just looks for opportunities and problems. And, being in the modern world, it usually sees a lot of problems. So I would encourage anyone, I can't remember the Japanese name for forest bathing.
Yeah, yeah.
right? But
Shinrin
I think
yoku. Shinrin
yeah,
yoku. Yeah.
no, Shinrin-yoku. So I mean that I think is a fundamental human need, because otherwise our attention becomes like a periscope instead of like a candle. And when we're radiant like a candle, we can communicate and connect and be aware of anything and everything at the same time that we need to. And that's not like I have some special talent. I think that's just the nature of our attention. So if I was to like say, if there's one thing that I brought out of the bush with me, it was a very different sense of attention, which made growing up with other young people my age and the rest of where I grew up in Canada kind of strange, because they wanted to play video games and I wanted to go live in the bush and, build a hut. So yeah,
What was your lineage? Your birthplace, your lineage, your parents. Tell me a little bit about that.
it's actually the funniest mix you could imagine, I think. On one side of my family, there's Aboriginal people. Again, I don't know the Japanese name for that. In Chinese, it's Indiaran, the original heart-centered people.
Uh-huh.
And another part of my family is actually the descendant of English royalty. So
Wow.
in the sense of karma, there's quite the the dog and the cat going on. And then another part of my family is Jewish and German, which left Germany when before the Second World War. And another part of my European ancestry goes from the Sami people in Norway. Yeah, so I'm a mutt, I think we would say in Canadian, which is a dog of too many parents.
Wow, but wow, what a rich genetic blend. Amazing. So when you were growing up, were you growing up in a First Nations environment only, or were you on the edge of it? Where were you?
I would say it was very much like what we would call cowboys and Indians,
Okay.
because part of my family being First Nations or Indigenous, having those traditions and stories and ways of being in the world and being on the land. And then a lot of the other people in my family being white, more racist, more stuck with ownership and competition. And it was a very interesting place to grow up, because there was a polite sense that we weren't really going to yell at each other, but everyone was always kind of mad at each other about something within that community. My family managed to work most of it out most of the time. But anytime we were around, gatherings of people, it was always sort of group cowboys and then group Indians.
Wow. Wow. That's almost unimaginable, for a lot of people listening to even begin to get their head around what it's
Yeah,
like.
I think if I grabbed a picture of me as a kid, there's me and two of my siblings that are mixed blood, and then I have two other siblings that are full blood. So it's a really good picture of like, so how does this work? Because it was kind of like half the people you grew up around are native, and then half the people aren't.
So your attention wasn't just being utilized literally during hunting and fishing expeditions. You must have used that same skill set to navigate a lot of the enormous relationship obstacle courses that were around, and what to say or how to be in certain situations. It must have been, in a sense, very stressful, I would imagine.
I think parts of it would have been considered pretty stressful, but at the same time, whose childhood doesn't have
Yeah.
something in it that's a particular dragon in your closet that keeps you orientated to fear and needing help? But I can say that, and maybe this is a weird story, but I think in the last year we were still living there, my parents used to tell people who came, because I lived in a hunting lodge, so we would have guests come and then, get on a horse and, go and try and shoot something. But I had developed this strange kind of hypervigilance and empathy, partially just because I wasn't a very distracted person, and I always find people very fascinating. But I think you're also quite right that I grew up, trying to manage other people's emotions to make sure I wasn't a source of some kind of stress or problem. And that served me very well, again, as a martial artist and probably mostly as a clinician, because I think I just have a natural kind of inborn empathy for people. because I'm aware that awareness really helps solve a lot of problems.
That's an insightful. That's an insightful, very prescient thing to say. That awareness is so fundamental to any kind of healing, any kind of relationship, and yet it's the one that is provided, in a sense, least by our healthcare professionals. But before we go into the medical aspects of what you're doing, or the healing aspects of what you're doing, so I know you came out of a very rich, multi-blended background, which had its own trials, as all childhood. There is nothing like an ideal childhood, and we should encourage all parents to fully be aware of the fact that there's no such animal. Everybody's got an issue growing up. Otherwise, why would you come here? And but I know then that you had, so you're growing up, you get into martial arts fairly early on in your life. Is that right?
Yeah, I started at 10.
Oh, that is very early. What did you start off with, and why?
Judo, because it was the only thing I could find. I love that sport and that practice. And I don't know how to say this without risking offending someone. But I just wanted to punch and kick people. So
very healthy.
So I spent I think about a year in judo, and then went to full contact karate, and I did that until I got my black belt. I think that took about 5 years.
Wow.
And then I moved to the other side of the country, and then I ended up meeting this very, very high level teacher, and he taught Northern Shaolin, Wing Chun, specifically from the lineage of Bruce Lee.
Oh.
And the internal styles like Qigong, Bagua, Xingyi, and something really rare called Zaranmen and Yichuan, which are really uncommon martial arts. And I studied with him until I was about 24, 25. And we trained about 6 hours a day, 6 days a week.
Wow.
Yeah. It was like Shaolin monastery training. It was pretty full on.
Wow. Give us an example of what a 6-hour period of training would have involved for you.
I wake up at 6 a.m., go and do Qigong for an hour. Then I would I was going to university to study to be an engineer, but then I would go from school to the gym at lunchtime to do either Shaolin strength training or like gymnastic or weight resistance training. Then I would go back to school, then I would go and eat, then I would go and train for 3 hours or train or teach at that point, depending on, well, when I first started, I wasn't teaching, but by the time I was about 23, I was teaching part-time under like assistant teaching with my master at the time. And then I would go and train on my own for a couple hours in the park at night. Wow. And that continued up until I was about 30 years old. Oh, like about 29 years old, yeah. And then I ended up getting very ill with something called Crohn's disease, and then I had to take about a year to just recover from that, because I actually almost died in the hospital. I got down to 112 pounds. Tell
us about Crohn's disease and what it does to you.
So Crohn's disease is an inflammatory bowel disorder. It causes ulceration and damage mostly to your small intestine, although it can cover a lot of, it can come up into your throat, it can go all the way down. It can affect your entire body because it's an autoimmune disease. But when you can't digest food and your immune system is fighting you and itself, you end up using about twice as many calories per day, and then you end up losing a lot of weight. And that's often what happens to people in the hospital with cancer or other diseases that we used to call consumption.
We used to call them consumption, yeah.
Yeah, because they used to consume people up very, very quickly. So after getting out of the hospital, and I had a pretty shamanic experience there, then I had to take some time to heal and, realize that I needed to study a lot more about nutrition. And then I went from a focus in Chinese medicine more into functional medicine and evolutionary nutrition and things like that. And that's been the focus of my practice ever since.
So it was literally a case of, here you are, I can imagine you must have been a really powerful individual at the peak of your life as a man with all of this martial arts consciousness embedded in you, and suddenly that's ripped away from you almost mercilessly, and you're losing weight and you're dying in a hospital. So do you think that your martial arts training, your attention, your awareness made a significant difference to you getting through that?
Honestly, at first it made it worse, and then when I finally became humble, it made it better.
How did it make it worse?
I think honestly, one of the biggest reasons I got into martial arts and trained so heavily is because I had PTSD from a lot of abuse as a child.
Oh,
So although I grew up in what might be considered a pristine, happy Taoist environment in a way, it was also right next to all of the people and the people in my family who had gone through residential school abuse or who had a lot of trauma in their family. So it was not a safe childhood in any way at all.
oh, I see.
So as I became more dangerous in the sense of being a fighter, it took me about 3 months to finally admit I needed to go to the hospital.
Okay.
Because I was so determined to fight the disease and fight a lot of the things that were coming up, from within as I tried to sort out a lot of the things that had happened to me as a kid.
So that's a very shamanic process you've just described. What I see is totally missing from conventional culture, where our doctors try to help us, is that very few of those doctors have ever been through anything like that, to experience the depths of despair that a human can be in that condition, to understand it, to have empathy for it. I mean, here in Japan, the Western doctors do their very best not to touch you. It's that bad.
Oh my goodness.
They're not even going to touch you. It's all hands off, and based on this, we'll give you this, and it's very quick. The scientific rationale, we understand it has its part. So you had a whole bunch of shamanic training growing up in many different ways that led you more or less in the direction of traditional Chinese martial arts, and then by extension perhaps the medical knowledge coming from 5,000 years ago there. So maybe you could go into how you flowed into that acupuncture Moxibustion world.
It's never the story people want to hear because, and I don't think this is probably the first time I've actually answered this honestly.
Good.
Only because I've only very recently come to be aware of another part of this little story that is my life.
Wow.
So I feel honored to actually share this with you, especially because of how we know each other. So I had this really bad accident when I was about 24 years old. And it was also a pause in my martial arts training because I fell off of a mountain when I was rock climbing and broke a couple of things and did a lot of damage to my body. And it took me about 6 months to be able to get back to training. So it wasn't as devastating in the sense of an autoimmune disease, but at the time, it was a very terrible accident. It actually took me 36 hours to get to a hospital. And the number of misadventures that happened between me almost dying on the side of a mountain, hanging off of a rope in shock, having to be rescued, to finally getting to a hospital it used to be one of my favorite drinking stories when I used to drink because it seemed so funny.
Oh,
And then this happened. Oh yeah, and you can't believe it, but then this happened. So maybe I could tell that story someday. But anyway, so at the time I was in my last year of engineering, and I was getting close to graduating, and I had a couple of different kind of career paths set up before me, including being a martial artist, but as an engineer. And a few months after that rock climbing accident, I basically threw away my thesis, got on a plane, and went into the mountains to become a hermit to study to be a Taoist priest.
oh.
And I had no idea at the time that I had severe complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and I was completely dissociating from the fact that I had nearly died and hadn't dealt with the fact that for 36 hours, all of this hellish stuff had happened to me before I finally got to the hospital.
Mm.
And after I did all my initiations and stuff with those people, they encouraged me to study Chinese medicine. So I actually got to study Chinese medicine in an actual oral Taoist tradition. I didn't actually even go to a school.
Oh.
And after that, then interestingly enough, I was just out of school a few months of my own training to be a doctor of Chinese medicine. And this was before there was licenses and things like that in Canada. And some friends asked me, would you like to come and teach Chinese medicine? And honestly, I was hoping to go surfing or something to just take a break. But that rock climbing accident really defined my personality, because anything that was familiar to holding on for dear life and not letting go and always trying to move ahead or to grind your way through 36 hours of intense pain as you get bumped around through various situations, for the next 20 odd years of my life, and I've only come to realize this in the last few months, almost every choice I made was the choice that would feel familiar to being stuck on the side of a mountain hoping I didn't die.
Okay.
You know, and many great things have happened, so I'm not, crying a crocodile tear of looking for pity. It's more of like, I just came to realize a whole bunch of the decisions I made, as amazing as they have been, and I don't think maybe I would have made other decisions, but I'm just aware that those decisions were based on a kind of shamanic state of conflict with death. And it wasn't until I experienced something called ibogaine that I actually came to realize that, oh my God, that's not actually really who I am. And I really started to shift a lot of things around in kind of how I live and what I do.
Well, a lot of our listeners and viewers will have no idea what ibogaine or ibogaine is. So maybe I could offer a little bit of information, not having experienced it directly as you have, but having friends who have. My understanding of it, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that ibogaine has been used as a healing plant from a tree-like, almost like an ayahuasca-like vine. I don't know. You can fill me in. And taking ibogaine can last up to 3 days of very highly altered state of consciousness, during which time, and again, you'll tell me of your experience, during which time, because it's legal in the United Kingdom when used with a nurse on hand. And my friend Graham Hancock did it after his father died, in the hope of meeting his departed father's spirit, because the lore goes that you will meet all of your ancestors and you will find out where the issue really erupted from. So that's what I've heard. But now tell me about your experience, Michael.
I would preface it by saying I started using Yopo about 2004, which is a kind of snuff that's blown up into your nose. And this was when I was beginning my official training as a medicine person with the elders and medicine people that I could find where I live now. After that, I got into what's called huachuma, which is a big cactus. Yeah. And it's not quite as much of a hallucinatory experience as, say, ayahuasca. And I believe I've done ayahuasca 12 times, somewhere around 10 or 12. Part of that was for my own healing, and part of that was in request to being in support for ceremonies, because one of the things that I may do in the future is actually go and spend some time with a mentor in the Amazon and actually study how to work with that medicine more. And most of that was because I was dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder and some addiction and, usual things we all get into when we haven't really found the home within ourselves. And those things all helped very much. And I've always been researching and learning things that have helped me along the way. But honestly, it wasn't until I went through the ibogaine experience, which you described fairly accurately, I think, that I really understood what I couldn't understand any other way. And I did a whole podcast on it. It's about 2 hours long.
Oh, I'll have to add that to this.
Which is probably just me ranting about how finally I get it. um, but it was probably it was definitely the most truth telling and honestly weird. Like ayahuasca is intense and world altering and jarring and very, very hard on you, but also very nourishing and supportive. I think of ayahuasca kind of like a grandmother who's, pushing you ahead, but also giving you a bowl of soup, which
Yeah,
you'll probably throw up anyway. um,
good analogy. Yeah.
Ibogaine for me was kind of more like my uncle who rides a motorcycle who has a gun in his waistband and will probably punch me if I don't keep attention on what he's doing,
Uh-huh.
but really, really loves me and, wants me to be well, but isn't messing around one little bit.
That's
And
an excellent description. Yeah.
it was 36 hours of getting my ass kicked, but in a very gradual but obviously sequential and beneficial, like, removable. It's like removing the layers of an onion. And I understood what was going on. I just didn't have any control over how it was going. And actually, I believe I set a record with the people there. I threw up every 46 minutes for 32 hours nonstop.
My God, that's incredible. That's just
it's one word for it.
wow. I mean, I've done some throwing up in my time, but that tops every throw up ceremony I've ever been at. That's brilliant. Wow.
Yeah, I've got a pretty hilarious Ibogaine throwing up story if we ever decide to get into shamanic shenanigans.
I look forward to that. But one other thing about Ibogaine, a lot of people listening may not know, is that a great deal of very wealthy and very addicted people head off to Africa as a last resort and do 2 or 3 days of Ibogaine ceremony, and it seems to fix the issue. So if you could encapsulate what you felt that the Ibogaine or the Ibogaine did that really set you straighter, what was the main issue, perhaps you could call it, that you became aware of?
We understand in Chinese medicine that the mind leads qi. And in shamanism, we often use the term thought forms. If I learned anything from Ibogaine, it was that any identity structure that I held that was not fluid and dancing and alive and actually real was killing me.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
That's a good one. Wow. Flow or you go.
I'm getting a t-shirt made up with that.
Oh, wow. Flow or you go, boy. Excellent advice. That's really excellent advice. And that kind of brings me to the 49 days of cold showers, sobriety, and mindfulness, and which is, what I've been partly involved in as one of the people following your teaching and your suggestions, which are all absolutely wonderful and apropos. So you are actually, from what I can understand, we're not halfway through this course yet, but what I understand is that you're really helping people to get a way deeper, way more 360 appreciation of their being, and that being is not fixed in stone anywhere, but can very easily get fixed in heavy granite through thought forms, addictions, or anything else, which basically most of the world is now into that thought form. So, from my point of view, you're a doctor that everybody needs. So tell us a little bit about what you discovered through, and I've got notes here. You've basically, integrative health, from what I understand here, is that you're taking traditional Chinese medicine here, which includes acupuncture and herbs. The flow of energy through meridians is how Westerners understand it. You're also dealing with functional medicine, which finds, helps to find the sources of dysfunction. And you've also got neurosomatic therapy in there, as well as the whole Aboriginal backdrop of nutrition and understanding it. It's an amazing blend. It really is. It's a truly unique blend. I can't think of anybody else has this blend. So you've taken all of this knowledge from the East, from the West, from the native tradition too. And if there was ever a group of people on this planet who were aware in their environment and who understood real health and integrity, it was the Aboriginal people of every continent on Earth. They all share the same thing, whether they're from North America, Central, South Australia. It's all the same. Get in touch with your planet, first of all. Get in touch with your planet. So from that very rich background, which has taken decades for you to develop, you came up with this idea of spending 49 days doing something. So tell us about how that came to be, what your expectations are, what you offer, as much as you can about it.
So when I initially got involved in the Taoist tradition, I was like many people. I was actually 17 years old, and I was running around looking for a teacher or a master.
Wow.
I think there was a couple of really bad translations of the Tao Te Ching that for me was, a golden elixir because it was as close to the truth as I could get. And then the Tao Te Ching is, I'm going to have to explain something about this if this is okay.
Of course, it's important.
So I'm going to keep going backwards and then go forwards. So this is actually quite hard to talk about, but because I studied in an oral tradition of Taoism that goes back about 7,000 years, the stories that I learned from my teachers, and it's like being adopted in a family for that tradition, because it's not a religious tradition or a monastic tradition. It's what is called a guild tradition.
Oh, okay.
So, if you were training to be an acupuncturist or a chef or a carpenter or a warrior or something like that, you would be raised up in this tradition of Taoism specific to the guild or the craft you were learning. So the tradition I was raised up in or adopted by is called the Yi Da Huan Yuan tradition. And that basically means finding your return to the source through the practice of medicine.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that's why we call it a guild tradition. And it goes back a very, very long time. And the stories of the initial killings and burnings of the shamans that started about 5,000 years ago was actually the beginning of Taoism. Because before that, there was the indigenous people of Asia, the Chundran people, or the authentic human beings, which interestingly is what almost all indigenous people call themselves across the planet.
Yeah.
And about 3,000 years ago, maybe 2,500 years ago, in China, you would see the same kind of dancing with the same kind of costumes, with the same kind of over-the-top hyperbolic colors that you see right now in powwows in North America.
Wow.
So I try not to cry when I talk about this, but that's for me, that was sort of my weird foothold and hearthold, if that's an expression, to that Taoist tradition, because I was watching the death of my people's culture as I was trying to learn the dead culture of these people who had their culture killed 3,000 years ago.
Wow.
And it took me quite a long time to really get into a sense of clarity with all of that. But anyway, when I started to really get more invested in becoming ordained as a priest, or what we call a zhushi, which isn't actually a priest, it means a person of consequence in your village, someone who goes out of their way to be of service in some way. And that might be as a shaman or as a healer or as, I don't know, a good poet or a good cook. But a part of that tradition was to go and spend 49 days completely alone in the bush.
Oh, that's where it comes from.
Yeah. So my primary initiation when I began my post rock climbing, post-traumatic stress freak out was I need to go and be ordained as a priest. I need to go and live in a monastery, or I need to go and live as a recluse, because I was not aware that that accident had completely like messed me up in a way, not in a horrible way, but it just made me very kind of hyper focused on life and death and meaning. So I thought, what's the most important thing I could do with my life? And as a young man, I had many, many years, but I didn't think of it that way. So I dove into this 49 days of deep solo practice. And during that period of time, I was instructed by the planet, Mother Earth, and I could tell that story someday too, to go back and be of consequence to people, not just to myself. So instead of living for the rest of my life as a hermit, which was the plan, I ended up going to work in industry as an engineer and then go and study Chinese medicine.
Uh-huh.
Right. So that's where the 49 days comes from as a tradition. And in that tradition also, they ask you to spend at least one of your lives on the red road.
On the red road?
Yeah. So in Taoism, the red road is the road of fire, which is families, kids, jobs, taxes, cars, bills. Yeah.
What are some of the other roads?
There's white, there's red, and then there's blue. But the red road is the road of being a consensual part of a functioning community down here on the ground, instead of going off, to be a sage in the mountains. Because if you're going to be at some day maybe a sage, you might want to know what you're talking about when people come up the hill to talk to you.
Yeah.
So, the one practice is the 49 days, and then another practice is to go and live a family life as long as that takes. And my son just moved out. He's going off to university. I'm doing what in Canada we call an empty nest. And I've been trying to decide, is now my red road over? Should I move on to maybe monastic life, or I aspire to maybe be a writer in some way, or do other things? So I'm trying to decide within myself, do I want to be a doctor for another 25 years, or do I want to go and maybe do something else? And the first thing that came to mind is I should do 49 days. And I woke up one morning a couple of months ago, and as sometimes happens, I have to run to my desk and write down a whole bunch of ideas, or else, well, I don't even have a choice. I just wake up like 10 minutes later after writing down all these ideas. And then I was like, that would be a really good idea given the internet. I could just go online every morning and do the practice with people and just give them a sense of the way each of us naturally unravels the separation we have with ourselves. So, and I'm glad you're coming to play along when you get to visit with the group, because in my mind you're an elder and a mentor, so that beams a certain amount of respect and a sense of reciprocity and accountability for me. So I'm very grateful for that. But there's also many people who are doing this, who are sending me message saying things like, "I'm finally able to stay sober. I'm finally able to get over what happened to me as a kid. I finally learned to trust a meditation practice because it isn't always the same blank wall. I have many things to work with, if it's breath work or posture or movement or stillness." And as you know, we're only halfway through and not even quite there yet. So I'm really excited to share with people. Each week we have a certain focus, but I'm also very excited for the last week because, and I can't, give away any secrets too soon, but I'm curious what people will do when they're offered the experience of a very ancient Taoist or a very contemporary indigenous experience of what spirituality is, when there's no nouns.
When there's no what?
Nouns.
Oh. All right. Tell us more about that.
In some ways in Chinese, but in many more ways in the few Aboriginal languages I've had exposure to, nouns are very optional.
Mm.
And in fact, there's often a sound you have to put in the Diné language, which is my grandmother's people's language. You actually have to put a sound in the middle of a word that tells you that you're talking about that part of the universe as a thing.
Ah.
Because otherwise, it's just the universe universing a chair or a dog or a table or your spouse or your kid. because everything is animate and expressing something and limited by its ability to express itself in the world.
Mm.
So from that perspective, the idea of the God who is the creator of the universe, one, that's really, really boring because it's been figured out. And it's not really something you can relate to because it's infinite instead of limited to its own, foibles and blessings, which is what I it's a very hard thing to put across in English, because even for most English speakers, they go, oh, yeah, yeah. And then they start talking about things in sequences with nouns doing something. So I'm hoping that my experiment on an experiential level will be successful in helping Westerners shake off the need to know instead of the opportunity to experience.
Wow, that's profound. Getting it down to the level of language, because that's what we think in is with language. Yeah. Therefore, we define reality through our language. And if nouns are the principal players in our language, then things, thus matter, will become central to our existence, which is precisely where we are now. In the materialistic phase of human evolution, probably that has ever been dared to be imagined, we have become the noun. And so to take it to that level is very interesting, because that's a level of healing. That's a level of consciousness of healing that nobody's even crawling towards right now, apart from some of the really first-rate philosophers on the planet who grok it.
That's the word, grok. That's all
really,
we can use.
There's like 2 other people have grokked it, but inevitably we're going to have to make that journey of discovering that we are never a noun. We never have been. We never will be. And like you said, to get your head around that is difficult. So here you are. You're taking, from my perspective, and I hope I don't offend anybody, your side of the Pacific Ocean. But
oh, please do. Please do. They need it.
I'm living in an ancient warrior culture, where talk about cold showers. To become a Shinto priestess, you get up at 3 o'clock in the morning all through the year. You go down to the river and you throw buckets of water over your head for about an hour before you start your prayers. And that's called misogi, which means purification. Or you stand under a waterfall. And interestingly, the participants might be interested to know that there's an enormous boom in waterfall asceticism in Japan now among women.
Really?
Women. So you're seeing women in their 30s, 40s, all the way through, even younger, standing 2 degrees centigrade out of temperature in a freezing cold waterfall, doing mantras. And then you have to ask yourself the social question, why are women of marriageable age doing this? It's because they've realized the total valuelessness of where society wants to take them. And so they're going somewhere else. So the cold showers, I really encourage people to I know you're being nice with them, and you can have a little bit of hot and a little bit of cold. Here we just go straight into the cold, even if it knocks us out flat, and we stay there with it from day one. And we do it every day for years and years and years and years. And then after a couple of decades, you can start saying to people, you know why the British boarding schools used to have guys do cold showers? It wasn't torture. We thought it was torture, right? So the cold showers is phenomenal. Meditation. But what I'm really interested in what you're doing right now is the somatic awareness that you have developed with Qigong. Let's go into that one for a bit.
Well, that's like opening about 19 encyclopedias at once. Maybe you want to pick a letter?
Okay, I will pick the letter of modern, you're in Canada, modern Canadian bodies / the kinds of ailments people will tend to get, and how a simple somatic awareness exercise will help them move to a deeper awareness of those issues?
So the easiest model that I can think of that would fit this conversation, and if what I'm saying has any possibility of offending someone, can you let me know? Okay, so imagine that there's a samurai on a horse. And the samurai has like a telescope or some binoculars that can see really far.
Yeah, I got him.
And if you were to imagine that that combination of a horse and a samurai, man or woman, and the binoculars make up a whole human conscious being.
Mm.
So if you look at your central nervous system, your reflexes, how tired or how strong or how fit or how wounded, how tired, maybe how inflamed or chronically ill people are, how you feel in your nervous system and in your body as an animal is your horse.
Uh-huh.
And that makes up a very significant part of your conscious and your sentimental and your cognitive reality. Because if you're riding around on a sick horse that, you know, is covered in, I don't know, some kind of insect that is chewing away at it, the samurai is probably not going to feel that confident and may already feel a sense of illness and dishonor because it's riding around a very sick horse. So we as conscious beings sometimes are very unconscious of the messages we get from our horse or from our animal body.
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing I always encourage my patients or my students to do is have that conversation. You know, let's go for a walk. Let's do some stretching. Let's do some qigong. Maybe we could do something that has to do with our voice and singing, so that we can touch in with, oh my goodness, this is actually how my body feels. And you know, whatever adjective or description you would have of your body is the way you feel about your horse, and the horse feels the same way about you.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you tell your horse, I'm tired of you always, you know, being fat or being skinny or being tired or being hungry or being having pimples or something, the horse is going to look at you and say, well, I'm tired of you telling me I'm a bad horse. You're not doing me any service by, you know, waking me up in the morning with bad food and coffee and then putting me to bed at night with tequila and painkillers. So
It's such a brilliant analogy. Like I got it. I just grokked it. My horse just went, listen to this guy.
Yeah, well, let's listen to each other.
Really, that's brilliant. So checking with your really where your body is at.
And that's why the cold showers are so good, because even in traditional Aboriginal culture, every morning you get up, and as young people, you don't just go to the water, you run to the water as a race. As you get older, you just make your way to the water before you fall on your head. But every morning, everyone gets as close to or as far into the water as they feel is appropriate for their age. So this is something that's been going on forever, because we all know you have to take care of your horse.
Mm-hmm.
So usually I use the term cowboy, because in Western culture, cowboys are sometimes related to someone who thinks very sentimentally, because the music in Western culture that they play is usually around my divorce and my dog and my farm and my horse, you know, and things like that, because that culture is very much about feeling kind of the sadness of loss and the empowerment of brotherhood and family and things like that. So it's a strange version of traditional culture, but it's also very sentimental, and it's easy to make a bit of humor about that in the West. So I'm not sure if using a samurai is appropriate.
No, don't worry. People won't be offended.
But I'll do my best.
So tell us about the samurai.
So in my experience as a warrior, there's a difference between a warrior and a soldier. A warrior still has autonomy and is out there to be of service in some way. You know, and I think if we look at the word samurai as you know, directly translated, it doesn't mean badass who hits you on the head.
No, it doesn't.
Right? Yeah. So when we think of that part of being a samurai as a man or a woman, it's about our ability to be ethically responsive as a social being, or to be less damaged as a social being, or to damage other people less, or at least the least amount as a social being. There's many levels to being, a person in the world, and maybe levels is the wrong way to look at it. Maybe if I was to think of a compass, there's many places you can find yourself on your journey, and none of them are right or wrong, but each of those compass directions will fundamentally determine how you see yourself and how you fit into the world. And that belonging and relational self um, is very lost outside of a culture that really embraces how to be that way. You and I first met in a sweat lodge. I mean, I think we met before that, but we really met as men in the world in a ceremony that was about community and grieving and praying and belonging. And that's the big word, belonging. I've never lived in Japan, but I've had many friends who are from there or who have lived there, and I sometimes hear what people in Canada hear about Japan, and it sounds like belonging there is a very subtle art.
Yeah.
And there are strategies and there are rules and things that make it a unique opportunity and also a unique challenge to actually feel like any of us deeply belongs within our family and within our community, within our extended family, even into the workplace. And, all cultures use shame and shunning to motivate each other and to keep a sense of being together and collective and trying to collaborate. And I like the word shunning more because that's more of an instinct, and shaming seems more like you're trying to tame an animal. So we all instinctually feel when we're shunned, when we're left out, when there's a distance that's pushed on, there's a pushing away with people. And we all carry those wounded feelings deeply within our gut, within our abdomen. And there's many expressions in almost every language I've ever learned that are very poetic ways to express feelings in your body that are very, very common amongst people. So I think this is just a part of being human that, say in Australia, they would say, "Oh, I'm gutted because my marriage just ended."
Yeah.
And then there's 1,000 more expressions that way.
Yeah.
And there's many ways that we adapt to those changes. Sometimes we adapt and become stronger and better communicators and more honest. And many times we become more manipulative or more codependent or more what's called passive aggressive or other things that help us control how other people feel about us. But what's really the worst part of that is that we are so out of control with how to belong that it's like an emergency stressor to just get through a conversation or to try and make a friend or to try and go on a date. So depending on how good your samurai feels about its relationship with belonging, that's going to determine very much the health of you as the person, but it's also going to determine how well your horse is doing, because you decide when it gets fed, you decide how hard to kick it, you decide whether or not it's going to get a day off or proper exercise and all those things. So there's a symbiosis there, of the animal nervous system body and then that social, bonding self. And most of what we actually get caught up in with emotion is a combination of our stress physiology and our relationship function or dysfunction. And then the last part of us as beings is what I call the binoculars. And this is what people sometimes regard as a spiritual relationship, or sometimes the word existential relationship with the world. That's how we see it. And in my perception, and I can only speak from my experience as a person, I do not believe that anyone has seen the world through the same binoculars that I see the world through. And in no way would I suggest that that would be a good idea. And in no way, as a teacher, in the ways that I help people, would I ever assume to suggest what another person sees through their own binoculars. I would just ask any human being, whoever hears my voice, to ask yourself, why are you looking through them that way? And did you put them there yourself? And can you put them down if they're not serving you and pick up another that may?
Very good questions. Yeah.
You know, because I don't, if I ever have answers for that part of life, please just come and hit me on the head. I need to be taken away for some time alone, because yeah, the last thing we need is more people telling us what the universe is.
Mm, mm. The universe is unknown. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, speaking English, we kind of get stuck there, don't we?
There was a guy called Alfred Korzybski who started General Semantics. To get back to this noun thing very briefly, he said that we should abolish the verb to be from our language completely. And he invented E prime, English prime, the English language minus the verb to be. He is a shit face. They are such and such, right? Nouns, be, and adjectives. And be implies eternally will stay in that condition. He is an asshole
Right.
today, therefore he will be an asshole tomorrow and for the rest of his life. But no. I perceive that person right now behaving like an asshole. However, for 98% of the day, he could be an absolute charmer. Who knows? This kind of gets into what you're saying. And, I practiced writing my journal for 5 years without the verb to be. And it really helps. It really helps. Nothing is fixed in stone. It's all.
If I was to translate "he is an asshole" into Dinesh, the closest I could come to say is assholing that one him.
What language is that?
Dinesh, in English, people say Navajo.
Oh, cool. Wow. That's great. That's great.
And I want to clarify one thing, because if you were to try and say that, and I can't really say it exactly that way, but assholing that one of us, because the word for that one, it would be this one of for me and that one of for you, but it's the of that matters, not the one. So it's this one of everybody. So this one of the people in the sweat lodge is assholing right there. It's a verb, because it's the assholing that matters, not the person doing it, right?
It's brilliant, because people need to get inspiration from language too, and so you're communicating with people every day for 15 to 20 minutes about these three aspects. So it's an easy to understand great image: the horse, the samurai, and this. And yet, everything in modern culture, especially in Canada, that I see more and more when I go back there, is about the materialistic looking after of parts of the horse. This is good for the horse's tail. This is good for the horse's bum. And if you take enough of this, the horse will get better. Despite the meditation and the mindfulness input, the reality is that the majority of people do not know the horse at all, do not speak to the horse. When was the last time you said, "Thank you, heart. Thank you for beating endlessly, all this time. Thank you, knee." Having a conversation with your body, something as simple as that. But we have specialists, we have neurologists, we have psychiatrists. However, you are not throwing the baby out with the water, because I know that you do proper medical or literally microscopic testing to take care of other aspects of the health that could be fixed by nutritional methods. For example, tell me how you do that.
Sometimes it's based on what's called pathophysiology, or the process of the disease.
Uh-huh.
So if a person has an autoimmune disease, and that's my primary focus in medicine.
Oh, I see.
There's about 10 or 20 different things that are going to be going on in that person's body because of the autoimmune process. And some of them are very easy to test very accurately. So like any other doctor, when I'm seeing a patient, I'm like, we can go with this protocol. And if you don't have very much money to spend on your health right now, I would rather you spend it on your horse than on, the numbers on a piece of paper. So we can go ahead with this protocol, and if you get better, we'll decide that the protocol was the test because it works. If we're going along with this protocol and it doesn't seem to be working, then it might be a good idea to invest some of your time and money into some lab testing to look at some numbers on a piece of paper that tell us which of those 20 things is actually the most important thing right now.
Mm, mm.
And for many people, that's the real win in the sense of being strategic. It's not that now we have a magic pill and you can go home and go back to whatever was happening that made you sick in the first place. It's more a sense of, okay, a general direction was not specific enough, so now we need to be more specific. But because I live in a small town where there's not a lot of people with high-paying jobs, again, my preference is to say, let's put you on the protocol that's an 85% chance success. And if it doesn't work, then we'll go deeper into the medical chemical side. And usually that takes care of things. And then sometimes when I'm working with people, and usually I can see this very quickly, but it's not very polite to just tell people that I can see that they're carrying a lot of childhood trauma within their nervous system, within their samurai or their gut self, and that maybe they're using their binoculars to try and make up a story that's going to keep them from actually having the time and patience and stillness to feel what's happening. So I may say, well, maybe you should try this protocol, or maybe we should try this lab testing. But quite often I just encourage people, maybe you should consider talking to me as a counselor.
Mm, mm.
And that's where the somatic mindfulness process comes in, and the neurosomatic therapy comes in. Because most people, from a very simplistic sense of Chinese medicine, we would say that your energy is blocked. That's a very simplistic way of putting it. But until people are willing to acknowledge that they're holding themselves together too tight, or they're so collapsed that they can't hold themselves together at all, that what we call zhongqi, or their inner vitality and resourcefulness, needs to be met again. And the samurai and the horse need to become very, very connected, and very healthy together. And then when a person picks up their binoculars and decides how they want to see the world, they're actually seeing it as a healthy person instead of a person who is trying to hide from a dark secret in their family, perhaps.
Wow, that's profound. I'm guessing that you stick with people for a fairly long time who come to you for help.
Oh, I would say some people come and see me for 3 or 4 times, and then the protocol starts to work, and then they just stick with the protocol. They may come back in a couple of months to refine some details, but I would say about half the people I see maybe 3 or 4 times.
Excellent.
And that's mostly because I've been in practice almost 25 years. So, and this may sound like false confidence, but when you tend to focus and specialize in medicine, you're going to get better and better statistically, because you're narrowing down your risk factors for failure.
Indeed.
So it doesn't mean that I'm in some way more effective than other clinicians by some magic. It's just that I've become very consistent about what I'm focusing on and what's working.
Tell
And
us,
I keep adding new things every time I learn new things. So there's that. I would say the second group of people that I see probably about 15 times.
mm,
And those are the people that the first 5 times are about getting into the protocol and getting to know each other. And then there's a period of time where we may do some counseling or go through some lab testing or get into more precise detail. And then they find a sense of autonomy and clarity and courage and resourcefulness to move on. And then I have patients that I've seen on and off for 25 years because we live in a small town, and if they bang their head or sprain their ankle or, get a bug traveling somewhere, then we sort that out. But yeah, I try and be as effective and as efficient as I can, because people actually have to pay me for my services for the most part.
and so over a 25-year period, obviously you've seen, perhaps you've seen an increase in a certain pattern that people will come to you with. As our culture has become so much more self-centered in one sense, so open in other senses, but definitely there's an increase in depression globally, absolutely globally. In Japan, it's catastrophic levels of depression. And do you find that also in your small town in Canada, that people are becoming more depressed and coming to you with depression related issues?
Yes, but I would say that from a clinical scientific point of view, in the last 2 years, there's been an evolution or perhaps a revolution in our understanding of depression. Almost everyone who's not an idiot, that wasn't very polite, sorry, is becoming very, very aware that the research is showing that most depression is because of chronic inflammation and chronic stress, and fundamentally a lack of feeling like we belong. And it's that precise combination of the kind of stress and the way we embody that kind of stress when we feel alienated or separate from other people, and how that exaggerates a very unique part of the immune system that's very urgent and has a lot to do with fight or flight and freeze and shock and things like that. And that produces a very specific kind of allergic reaction in the body that eventually triggers the same kind of response inside the immune system of your brain. And when inflammation goes up, neurotransmitters go down in your brain. Mm-hmm. So what we try and imagine that we can do with pharmaceuticals is sort of mess around with how serotonin works in your brain to at least keep the serotonin active.
Yeah,
which has honestly never been proven, and it's ridiculously flawed is the only word I can say, because the only thing that's going to help you is to reduce the stress physiology of the immune system, which is 80% the stress physiology of not feeling like you fit in a way that allows you to decompress your stress. Because without deep intimacy as friends, without deep intimacy as family, and hopefully with deep intimacy as lovers, that's how we actually heal, is through connection.
This brings up, there was a Harvard study done about 10 years ago of who had the longest lives in America, the healthiest lives. And they found a small community of Italians from one particular village in Italy that had emigrated en masse to this particular area of New York, I think it was, or maybe it was Boston.
I think it's San SoCal, California.
Oh, yeah. And what they found out was that the people, a very similar group of of other immigrants or other people who smoked this amount and drank this amount and did this amount, they were all dropping like flies in the 60s, but these guys were going on into the 90s, and they just couldn't figure out through the materials that they were putting into their bodies. And what they had totally missed was that these people met with each other every day, had meals together, sang together, danced together, laughed together, cried together, drank, smoked, plenty of oil and bacon and whatever. And be like 100. And they finally got it from Harvard, like, whoa, what kept you? These people have relationships that they continue to pour into.
It's funny, I'm actually just writing a paper on that. I was just researching that this afternoon on the blue zones, and how they have finally come to the consensus that the only thing that's similar amongst all of the cultures in the world, including Okinawa and Greece and a place in Costa Rica and that place in the United States, is the dinner table and the laughter and the crying and the yelling and the forgiving and the hugging. And they eat relatively food that's familiar to their genes.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if it's 100% vegan or vegetarian or not, or bacon or not. It's mostly that their physiology has adapted to that kind of food.
Yeah, there's something a bit offensive about this perfectly built, white, gleaming, toothy model of health, vegan Superman woman, and you go and you feel like creepy Like, does anybody hang out with this character? You know? You can't imagine having a dinner with this character. So I'm amazed to hear the synchronicity that's where your attention is right now, because it's so important. And here, as you said, in all traditional Oriental cultures, the web of relationships is way more important than the movement of any individual or the judgment of any individual within that web, because it's the web that holds everything together. And if you don't pay attention to the web, you're going to be dead spiders. So,
well, that's the most direct description of Japanese culture I've ever heard with respect to belonging.
yeah, it's kind of like that here. And so every time I go back to the West, I see so many wonderful, healthy things on the one hand going on, but the really basic stuff that you've discussed today about the horse and the samurai and this focal point binoculars, it is truly important for people to get, given the general dissolution of culture that we see everywhere around us, the destruction of native cultures, everywhere in the world at super high speed. But here, finally, the Ainu people who I've hung out with in Hokkaido, they're finally being recognized by the Japanese government, basically as human beings. It's astonishing that it's taken this long. And
I hope this doesn't offend anyone, but if I ever go to Japan, that's where I want to go.
Oh yeah, first place. I met their chiefs, and they said to me, you know what? There's two groups of people we hate, the Japanese and you whiteys. That was the first thing he said to me. Whoa, nice way to start a conversation, Jimmy. And then he brought out his art, and it was Haida. I said, no, that's not your stuff, that's Haida. He said, idiot, whitey. We've been talking to these people for thousands of years. That's why our art's the same. You don't know anything. And that was like in the first 5 minutes of meeting with a Haida chief. I call him a Haida chief, right? So the Ainu in Hokkaido finally are getting recognized. And it's like, are we going to have enough time left to return ourselves to the sanity of some of the things that you're talking about? Are you hopeful?
Can I give you a really strange, perhaps jarring example?
Yeah.
And I use this example a lot, so I recognize that it has a different feel given that you're in Japan.
Can't wait.
This is based on my experience when I was an engineer. So one of the most amazing feats of engineering was what the United States did in the late 1930s, early 1940s, when they retooled their entire motor vehicle industry to make armaments for war. Excuse me. So if one of the biggest global economies and material infrastructures in the world can turn itself inside out in the space of 9 months to build the entire US war effort throughout the Second World War, as an engineer, I'm very confident that if the planet decided to stop, sorry, a word that I can't swear, if we all decide to grow up a little bit and, cooperate or collaborate, I have no question at all that we can solve any issue that we face, ecologically, environmentally, socially, and obviously on the level of industry. And I can say although I sort of ended my relationship with any kind of practice as an engineer a long time ago, I'm always researching the new science and looking at the new things people are making. And honestly, my friend, we're 2 years away from exactly whatever we want to do.
I like that.
It's just getting to a tipping point of either social consensus or social transparency.
Yeah, I like that idea of 2 years. I'm beginning to see it myself. particularly in the strange places where quantum physicists and philosophers have got themselves to, as all explanations have failed, absolutely miserably failed to give them the slightest idea about what the hell is going on right now or who they are, but has brought up such gigantic ontological questions of maybe we're in a dream here. I mean, really. And if we are, well, maybe we can dream better. Maybe we can become lucid dreamers.
If that was the if that was the medicine for what we're ill with right now, I think that would work. But I think we have some healing to do before that need would actually feel like a need.
Still got that work to do, and we've got 2 years to do it. So
well, it's better than complaining.
Better than complaining. Well, I mean, this is definitely not going to be the last interview with Michael Smith. I saw one of your videos teaching Qigong Tai Chi exercises, and on your porch, and you were encouraging people, stick with this for about 6 months. And I thought, yeah, stick with it for about 6 years. I mean, can you stick with someone for 6 minutes?
Yeah, really.
And so, if you want a massive following, you tell them it's 6 minutes. But if you want serious people, you tell them it's going to be 6 years or 60. But those serious people will become the real dreamers, will become the real engineers of the future. And that's my message from the East to the West, because, when I began studying Japanese archery, I was like, what's next? What's next? Come on, what's next? And these guys are like 80 years old, and I'm like in my 20s, and they're drinking their tea, and I'm up there, if I shoot 800 arrows today, some of them are bound to bloody well hit. And they're drinking their tea like, oh, poor idiot, poor monkey. And after about 10 years, I says to the teacher, you really got to start teaching the secrets of how to hit the target now. And he turned around and says, the target? He says, you don't even know how to walk, Sonny. And I just went, oh, wow, there's a way to deflate a guy. But, that's how it works here, or that's how it did work here. So, I mean, I would encourage people, first of all, if you can't stick with 49 days with Michael, I mean, you really do need to get your head examined, because what you're being offered here is serious inner, outer, everywhere work. And I do encourage you, Michael, because I know you were interested in the idea of moving into to writing, other forms of expression. I mean, just putting down what we discussed today, there isn't any book out there. There isn't any book out there with this specific, brilliant combination of information. It's needed, it's wanted. What else can I say? You have it. Use it.
Can I tell you a deep, dark secret?
Yeah.
I figured out about 4 days ago that this 49 days project that I'm doing, I'm actually writing a book.
Yeah, there you go.
So I've been taking the audio and then having it transcribed so then I can edit it. But after 49 days, I'm going to have 49 chapters, which I'm going to do mostly as an audio book so people can listen to it every day as they go through the 49 days. But I'm going to probably at some point throughout because right now it's a free online thing. It'll always be free on my YouTube channel.
Yeah.
But I'm hoping to get people maybe in a few weeks to help me with a crowdfunding Kickstarter campaign so that I can actually edit the whole thing and then record it properly so that everyone who's gone through it or who maybe obviously will go through it in the future can have that as a more hands-on resource. So I just realized, because that's how I actually write books most of the time, is I do a series of talks and then I record them and then I transcribe them and then I turn it into a book. And I like I said just a few days ago, I was like, oh my God, I could turn this into a really helpful book. It's already
a very helpful book, and so definitely I would be interested in supporting that effort because, more and more we're feeling the stress. The stress levels are apparently getting higher globally. And we really got to nip this thing in the butt and get to grips with it. And what you're offering does just that. And already 90 minutes has flashed by.
Oh my God.
No.
I just want to throw this out there just before you close this up. It would be really fun to come to Japan and teach a 49-day class there while I wrote a book.
I was thinking that.
If you get some people together and make it work out, I can live basically on a futon with a cup, so I don't need much.
Well, the first step then is to get people to know what it is you're doing. And that will be our job, to get all of this discussion subtitled, get it out there, and then simply let the word out that here's an individual willing to do this with a group of people, but it's going to be a 49-day commitment. And I'm sure that there are people who are interested in doing that. I know there are. So it's just a question of doing the engineering aspects of it, building the bridge, getting the Chuck to go across there and deliver the message. But it'll happen. It'll happen. So,
well, I've always wanted to come to Japan, so it sounds like a reasonable reason to do it.
You should. In The Fountain, the great movie The Fountain, she always saying, right? You can, you should, you must, you will. So let's finish it there for today, and I'll talk to you again in the near future, Michael. Thank you very much. Thank you so much from Real Rover.
Blessings. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Welcome to Real Rover. I'm your roving host, John Craig. Real Rover へようこそ、Craig John でございます。Introducing you to people you would never have heard of if it wasn't for Real Rover. Here we go.